Good afternoon, everyone. I am really pleased to introduce today our speaker. I am very pleased to introduce Laura López Calonge. She's our Fulbright visiting instructor of Spanish for the 2021-2022 academic year. Laura realized that she loved languages even before finishing her bachelor's degree in Spanish philology at the Universidad Complutense of Madrid, the city where she was born but left almost 10 years ago. She enhanced her education in other institutions in Spain and Europe, including in the Czech Republic, and focused on teaching Spanish as a foreign language for her master's degree. She is currently preparing her PhD thesis on Spanish pragmatics and conversation analysis at the Universidad of Valencia. She has taught for over 5 years in high schools in England and India, as well as at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. She has worked in collaboration with the Cervantes Institute as an evaluator of Spanish language proficiency for non-native speakers of Spanish, and the Embassy of Spain in Trinidad, organizing cultural events. She loves nature, sports. India brought her the practice of yoga, connecting with other cultures, learning from them, and trying to make this world a better place to live. So without any further ado, I'm really pleased to introduce Laura López Calonge. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam, for your introduction. So I am going to share my screen, and thank you everybody for attending and being present, even if it's virtually present. So you should be able to see my screen now, I hope.
Yep, you're all set.
Yeah, okay. So this is a presentation that I did a bit of research to present this at Albright College for the fall semester. And what I'm going to present today is a little bit what came out from that presentation. So this topic is immigration in Europe, and I'm going to talk about the case of Spain. So the migration flows cannot be considered as a new or a circumstantial phenomenon from contemporary societies, because they have been present in the history of humankind since its origins, and they have been part of its evolution and progress since or throughout the centuries, right? So the map of humanity is not settled, not now and not ever. As we can see in this map, the dichotomy of the world nowadays is between the regions where people are, especially young people, which are the regions in red, and the regions where the economic resources are, which are the regions in green and lighter green. So the nations that will be able to capture the talent and the potential of the new generations will be the ones that will succeed eventually. So the case of Spain is not anything new either, because the migration started more than 3 centuries ago, when different civilizations, especially the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and the Greeks, coming from different parts of the Mediterranean Sea, they started to settle down in the Iberian Peninsula, which is nowadays Spain and Portugal, and they were trying to find new commercial relations that allowed them to expand their markets. So the first colony is this Cádiz in South Spain. Gadir was supposed to be founded by the Phoenicians around the 1100 before the Common Era, which means 400 years before Rome, the important capital of the Roman Empire, was founded. And this dynamic process of migrations continued throughout the Middle Ages, with some German groups coming from the north, mostly the north and the east of Europe, and of course the Arabs that arrived in Spain, in South Spain, in the 8th century and stayed for almost 800 years. So of course up to now, we can still see that influence, especially in the south of Spain, and we can see the influence in the architecture, in festivals, in food, even in the language, because there are many Spanish words that are coming from Arabic. So the history of Spain has been drawn, as we have seen, has been drawn by a continuous flow of people going and coming. And what is remarkable is that, in contrast to what many people may think, this cohabitation of those groups has been done in harmony and in peace for most of the time. Before talking about numbers, I have to introduce some general, very simple, but very important considerations about the topic. So the first one is what we consider to be an immigrant, because the word immigrant doesn't only refer to a legal status, but to a very complex sociological concept that includes something more than being a foreigner, right? So we could consider immigrants those persons with any kind of migration background that influences decisively in their vital experience, regardless of a first-hand move experience. And likewise, when someone acquires a nationality that is different from their country of origin or their family's country of origin, that doesn't necessarily delete this background either. So we might think that is the search for better opportunities, the driving force inherent in any migration movement. Sometimes there's a specific trigger like war or famine or political persecution. Let's remember that these forced migrations represent 26.5% of the total of international migrations. But nowadays, the migration flows are the direct consequence of something of a much deeper political, economic, and ethical problem, which is the increase of inequality in society, which brings enormous differences in the standard of living amongst countries, right? So a significant fact is that the majority of the migrations are not really coming from the poorest countries, but from those that have an average income. And again, in contrast to some general beliefs of migration being a phenomenon that occurs from poor countries to rich countries, the reality is that the majority of the movements are intra-regional, which means that they take place between regions within a country or within a continent. So here we have Europe in the first place, followed by Asia and North America, which are not in theory the poorest continents in the world. And I would like to point out 3 things of what we could see as a general tendency nowadays in global migrations. The first one is the feminization of migrations, because women are becoming more prominent in the migration movements in relation to the past. And nowadays they are 51% of the total of the migration movements. The second one is the importance of child migrations. Children are getting more recognition in immigration laws. And the third one is that people are migrating because of environmental issues. And this is a point that could fill another conference by itself. And that has brought also a lot of awareness in the recent decades and has become one of the main challenges on a global scale. So nowadays, this type of migrants are coming from parts of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And generally speaking, they are running from natural disasters like droughts, desertification, sea level increase. And some data from 2019 shows that there's around 25 million people that have been forced to migrate for environmental reasons, and 85% of these people are women. And the UN foresees that there will be 200 million people by 2050. And this situation has brought another term, another concept, like the environmental refugee, which still today doesn't have full recognition in international law. So, as we have seen in the graph before, the European Union is one of the main destinations for migrants. And before starting to talk about the immigration situation in Europe, I'm going to make some clarifications in order to better understand and have like a complete picture of how we could see events that are happening right now in Europe. So the first characteristic is that the free movement of workers within the European Union is one of its founding principles, and it is a very important element because it facilitates the process of inclusion of labor amongst the European citizens. And at the same time, it's a very complex system that requires global coordination of first labor and social security administrations, communication departments, and of course, the capacity of solving disputes amongst countries. So this is regarding the labor context, and regarding the demographic context that applies to most of the countries in Western Europe, shows first of all an aging process in the population, and second, and therefore a reduction of working age population groups. So this has been seen as a threat to the economic and social growth of European countries, as well as it spotlights the necessity of discussing, analyzing, and regulating the migration flows. Some countries have already realized that immigration doesn't really represent a problem, but it could be rather the solution that Europe may need to face its challenges as an old and worn out, or potentially at least worn out society, especially in economic and demographic terms. In the beginning of the economic crisis in 2007, European nations recognized and clearly saw the economic and social benefits that a regulated immigration could bring to the countries, not only of origin, but also destination and transit. So that same year, the idea of a blue card, similar to the green card that exists in the US, came up to start a new labor immigration policy based on workforce quotas, which means basically that after analyzing the workforce needs of the different countries, these countries would request a certain amount of immigrants to fill out the labor gaps, which would create a balance between countries depending on the amount of workers that they need. But the problem is still there, and the main challenge that the continent is facing is first the lack of cooperation between European countries, the general thinking that immigration is just a conflict that happens or that needs to be resolved in southern countries, which are the first that receive the immigration, and not something that affects every country eventually. And because at the end of the day, it is very difficult to have one same intention and 27 different policies. And apart from that, there's this risk of the growth of what has been called an imported underclass, which is basically, this is a model that rich small nations are adopting, like, for example, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, in which basically they have a visa system that allows them to import hundreds of thousands of low-paid migrant workers to work in industries, different industries, like, for example, construction is very popular, agriculture, but they ensure at the same time that few, if any, of those workers have a way actually to become citizens and get the social benefits that the country should grant them for the work that they are doing. And yeah, so before I start talking about the case of Spain, I'm going to mention very quickly something about the war in Ukraine, because after the war started in last February, of course, a high volume of migrants is expected to reach the 27 nation bloc from Ukraine, which will further increase the migration wave that the European Union is witnessing especially since 2015. So some countries that share borders with Ukraine, especially Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia, they prompted a vast humanitarian response by both governments and civilians. And the European Union has made what has been called a historical decision and has come to an agreement that includes immediate response to regulate the situation of the refugees by giving residency, temporary work visas, education, housing, healthcare access. So the UN has said that the war could produce as many as 4 to 5 million refugees. And if this displacement stretches out for years, it will present first long-term challenges for Ukraine, which would face a brain drain of big proportions, and also for host countries where resources are limited, and of course, anti-immigrant sentiment has run strong. But it could also mean opportunities, as always, because Eastern European countries like Moldova, for example, they have been experiencing depopulation for decades, and they could suddenly find themselves boosted by a large and educated immigrant population. Okay, so now the case of Spain. So according to the Institute of National Statistics data from 2021, Spain has reached 5.5 million people who reside in the country legally, but don't have Spanish nationality, which means 11.4% of the total population. And it is amongst the first 10 countries that receive international migrations. So it is in 1882 when data about migration flows started to be collected. So at that moment, what we can see is a massive immigration movement from Spaniards going to Latin America. And between 1911 and 1935, more than 2.8 million people departed from Spain. And between 1951 and 1975, 1.6 million people left the country. So 1975 is the end of the dictatorship. And since then, this amount has been reduced drastically, as we can see here in this line, up to the point that Spain has transformed itself from a country of immigrants into a country that receives immigrants. It is very remarkable that, that is a very dynamic process of both directions in the migration flows during the whole period between Spain and Latin America. It is also remarkable that around 57% of the outbound migrants that went to America returned to Spain at some point. And this intensity in the links in or within America, it's very important to understand the meaning and the composition of immigration in Spain in recent years, with a very strong representation of the Spanish-speaking population from Latin America. And it's from the 60s when Spain started at different states in its migration history, since some European countries instead of Latin America became the destination of Spanish emigration. And this situation goes until 1973, when the explosion of the oil crisis interrupts this flow, and it's definitely reduced since then. And since then, Spain would become a destination for immigration in the beginning of the 80s, when the first immigration law was approved, and the phenomenon of immigration is consolidated as a structural element in Spanish society. And what we can see in these graphs is that after so this graph is about immigration on the left, immigration on the right. What we can see that after the 2007-2008 economic crisis, the immigrant entries in Spain stopped drastically. So we can see here 2009. While there seems to be a tendency in the increase of immigration, also here after 2008, it's going up, especially in the 25 and 35 group 8. So if we look at this graph, we can see the main nationalities of immigrants in Spain. So I have already mentioned the important links that Spain has had with Latin America. So that could explain the current presence of immigrants from countries like Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador. No, Venezuela is also a case with more factors. So this could explain the countries, the Latin American countries, but like how can we explain, for example, the first country which is listed with higher rates in Spain, which is this one, Morocco? Well, the case of Morocco, first of all, of course, if we look at the map, we can see where Spain is located in relation to Africa, right? So in this Gibraltar Strait, which is 13 kilometers in its minimum width, that's what separates Europe from Africa. And this fact explains why Spain is the main gate for immigration entries into Europe in something that has been called the Mediterranean route, or more specifically, the Canarian route. Because if we see the map, and this map is a little bit distorted, it's always like that with the Canary Islands, because the Canary Islands are very much like in the south, but if you want to show Spain, they don't really appear. But they belong to Spain, but they are barely 100 kilometers away from mainland Africa, and they have become also an alternative route to get into Europe. So data from 2020 shows around 41,000 irregular entries in Spain, around 34,000 in Italy, 15,000 in Greece, the two other main countries to get into Europe. And in the case of Spain, this data means an increase of 30% with respect to the year before, to 2019. And this Canarian route that I just mentioned had its peak in 2006 in something called La Crisis de los Cayucos, or the Cayuco crisis, when massive waves of migrants departing from south of Morocco, from this region called the Western Sahara, would try to cross basically the ocean in these small little boats called cayucos, to get to the closest Canary island, which is Fuerteventura, and from there going to mainland Europe. So after this happened, Morocco, using European funds, of course, reinforced police controls in the north of the country, and that slowed down the migration flows from Morocco to Spain. However, the consequences derived from the pandemic have forced many to leave again their homes and restart this Canarian route since the middle of 2020. And yeah, I remember I was spending some months in Tenerife, which is one of the islands, one of the capitals of the Canary Island at that time, and there were camps for migrants all over the place, and the conditions were, I mean, not the best ones most of the times. And again, this lack of coordination between regions and ministries in Spain has provoked or had provoked a crisis in the reception and welcoming of those immigrants. Although these numbers of irregular immigration are decisive in the design of immigration policies, let's not forget that they constitute a very small part of the whole phenomenon of immigration in Spain. Because as it has been said, 5.5 million immigrants reside legally in the country. So yeah, so that's regarding Morocco. And I would like to mention also the second group, third country, which are the group of two countries coming from the Eastern European part, which those countries that used to be part to the European to the Soviet Union, especially in the case of Spain, Romania and Bulgaria. And these two countries in particular, Romania and Bulgaria, joined the European Union in January 2007 under a temporary moratorium of 7 years. So it was not until 2014 when the limitation of movement was finished. That means that only then they wouldn't need any permit to work in the European Union. And this, along with a high demand for workers in the construction sector and building sector, was a calling for those coming from Eastern European countries. We have to remember that the construction industry has been of really high importance in Spanish economy, especially since 1997, with the housing boom. So this situation would attract lower skilled workers to take jobs in this building industry. And according to the Central Bank of Spain, between 1997 and 2007, the price of houses in Spain rose 150%. And that explains in part why the 2007 economic crisis was especially harsh in Spain, because it collided with these consequences of the housing bubble that collapsed the whole country's economy. And yeah, for the last but not least group of immigrants that appeared in the list, you might be surprised to see the UK as the fourth country, as well as Germany. So there's an article written by this Diego López de Lera called Immigration in Spain in the late 20th century, those who come to work and those who come to rest. So the author points out it's the good climate conditions, especially in the Mediterranean regions, as well as the cheap prices compared to their countries of origin. They are an attractive lure for more than 350,000 people that come from mostly from Northern Europe, Germany and UK. It depends on the area, because there are some areas also with a lot of representation from Scandinavian countries as well. So with this context being explained, this map of Spain would show the majority of the nationalities. So we see Romanians mostly in the center of the country. Then we see people from Morocco in the Catalonia region, and then in Andalusia, where all these fields, agriculture fields are. We have the UK in these Alicante and Malaga regions in the south, in Andalusia. We have Venezuela in Galicia. So yeah, and going back to the Ukrainian war, just to mention that in the particular case of Spain, 115,000 Ukrainians live in the country. That's 2021 data. They live especially in Madrid, as we can see here, on the Mediterranean coast. And this distribution is relevant because that means that the majority of the refugees will try to settle in those places where they already have friends or family or Ukrainian communities. And it's in those places where people have already started to mobilize to welcome refugees at a personal and local level, and they are working with associations and local companies to bring people in and also to send supplies to the people who remain in the country, in Ukraine. So yeah, I have talked about past a little bit, contextualizing the case of Spain. I have talked about the present, what's the current situation in terms of nationalities that are more predominant in the country. And now I would like to, of course, say something about what we can expect about the future, what are the future perspectives. It's very interesting because there are a few articles that have recently come in the press, and it seems that it's getting more common. And they emphasize on the urgency of understanding immigration as a strategic priority. For example, this one said that Spain will need 7 million of immigrants within the next 3 decades in order to keep economic and social prosperity. Or this one that came just 2 weeks ago says migrants an economic engine, more and more necessary every time. So as it was said in the beginning, the demographic suicide is a reality that is affecting many Western European countries. The low birth rate and the population aging will lower the amount of people being able to work. There will be 95 million fewer working age people in Europe in 2050, than in 2015 under business as usual. Today, around 20% of the population in Spain is 16 years old or older, but in 30 years, so by 2050, it will reach 30%, which means 1 in 3 people will be retired. And that means that the country will have to raise spending on healthcare, elder care, and pensions by 10% of the GDP before 2050. And to be honest, I don't know where that money is going to come from. So we have this contradiction that there's a continuous increase in virtual connectivity amongst us, as well as strong liberalization of the markets. But at the same time, borders and barriers are getting tighter. And the arrival of immigrants and refugees has brought a resurgence of xenophobic movements and anti-immigration reaction in some countries, which shows that immigration is an European issue, but still a national one. And actually, some countries have adopted its particular positions instead of looking for a common and shared solution. And this is something that I read recently, and I think it's very interesting to bring it up, because the boom of social media and the boom of fake news, which have affected some of very transcendental events lately, starting with the Brexit, for example, is creating large misperceptions about the number and the characteristics of immigrants. So there is this very interesting study called Immigration and Redistribution, which is based on large-scale surveys and experiments that took place in the US and a variety of countries, European countries, like we have here Britain, Germany, France, Sweden, and Italy. And this study was conducted to investigate how countries or how natives perceive immigrants and how these perceptions influence their preferences for redistribution. So what they found was striking, because in all countries, respondents greatly overestimate the total number of immigrants, think immigrants are culturally and religiously more distant from them, and are economically weaker. That means less educated, more unemployed, more reliant on and favored by government transfers. So if we look at this graph, for example, this is the actual numbers of population who are immigrants. So let's have a look at the United States, for example, which is around, I don't know, between 13–14% of the population. And if we look at the perception of the amount of population who are immigrants, it goes more than 35%. And if we look at this, the actual amount of immigrants who are unemployed in Germany, for example, which is maybe, I don't know, around 7–8%. And we look at the perception, it goes almost up to 40. So yeah, I found that very interesting. But in any case, these misperceptions are actually eroding support for Europe's social democratic model, as well as for the United States' more limited social safety net. And this raises to me two fundamental questions. The first one is that if immigration from South continues at the same pace, will the social democratic model predominant in Northern European countries since the second half of the 20th century still prevail in the 21st century? That's the first one. And the second one, even, I don't know, more also important, do rich countries have any responsibility at all in this situation? Because if what they want is to have fewer immigrants, could or should they help poor countries become rich so that fewer people feel the urge to live? That would include helping them adapt to climate change, for example, or simply opening up the markets to developing countries' exports. Because if you want to have fewer immigrants, you would want poorer countries to take advantage of trade. I mean, does it make sense to think that because there is too much immigration, you should restrict trade? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but what I think is that one thing seems to be clear, and it's that immigration is unlikely to slow down if the situation continues like that. So in his paper, Can Africa Help Europe Avoid Its Looming Aging Crisis? Charles Kenny studies the case of Japan and its current labor gap that it has. And from that study, he states 3 potential responses to the fiscal stress and the slower economic growth. So he suggests 3 possible solutions. So one is the raising labor force participation by women and older workers. The second one is automation. And the third one is outsourcing. And he asks himself, okay, so will they be enough to stop the challenges that European countries are facing? And he says, well, I don't think so. They will be sufficient. So is this leaving immigration as a possible solution? But how can that be? How can immigration be beneficial? Well, first of all, immigrants create demand for jobs as well as fill them, so they can help rebalance the ratio of working to non-working populations. And this has a direct positive impact on the economic system, since immigrants contribute more to the social security system that they actually take from it. The majority of the people that arrive as immigrants are young people, so they increase the rate of employment, which helps combat the imbalance of or due to the demographic aging, right? And apart from the economic problem, immigrants could help also to solve other situations which are a big concern in Spain right now, like the massive exodus from countryside regions to cities that are not actually able to provide demandings that people ask for, or if they do, the conditions are not the best ones. So that's what we call la España vaciada, or the empty space, which appears here in this map. So if we look at the map, we see these regions in red. That means that they have between 0 and 8 inhabitants per square kilometer. And you might say, okay, but they are not too large. But if you have a look at the regions in orange, they have between 8 and 12 inhabitants per square kilometer. And they cover mostly the whole center of the country. And this is what we call la España vaciada, or the empty space. So that leaves basically only the the regions that are along the coast, Galicia and the Mediterranean coast, and of course Madrid, which are a bit more populated. But yeah, so some authors have urged to adopt a more all-inclusive approach that takes the phenomenon of immigration as something structural and not just as an emergency or a crisis. So maybe I should have changed the title of this presentation, not talk about crisis. This will allow to design more proactive and practical policies, for example, through education interventions like global skills partnerships, which will help match training in lower income countries to skills gaps in higher income countries. And this initiative could also help to fight the risk of creating an underclass, or for example, with a more flexible visa system that will let people move more fluently, as well as it will contribute to a radical reduction of the risks and the situations related to human trafficking, to mafias, for example. And of course, migration flows need to be stopped from being associated with security issues, and there's a necessity of addressing the problem from really a different perspective. And apart from that, of course, let's not forget that it's direct contact and communication between people of different ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, what eventually can breed trust. So yeah, and I would like to end this presentation with an idea that I have taken from a Spanish researcher, a professor of politics and philosophy in Spain. He's called Daniel Inerariti. And he says, in an interdependent, decentralized, and extremely plural world, it is necessary to tackle problems in an anticipatory, holistic, cooperative, and horizontal way. We need to open a new common path for the unforeseen events that are about to come. And this new path will require the participation and cooperation of all of us as a society. When you acquire some sense of civilization, you acquire a certain level of responsibility, and you discover that the others, also those who will be born in the future, deserve the same as you do. This is the truth about freedom. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. But on here you have some references if you're interested. Yeah, so that's the end.
Okay. Mike?
Go ahead with the announcement, Saul.
All right. First of all, Laura, thank you for this really, really interesting presentation. I appreciate when people can pull together informative data that you can rely on to have some authenticness to it, authenticity, and you've done that. So thank you so very, very much. My role here now, I'm Solomon Lauf, the President of the World Affairs Council, is to give you some upcoming event information, all posted on our website, almost all of it. The current state of relations, April 20, between China and Taiwan, with Richard Fontaine, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. May 5, we are very pleased to have our first live program in 2 years at the Doubletree Downtown Reading, May 5, lunch 11:15 to 12, and then from noon to 1, a foreign affairs panel discussion with Representatives Christy Houlihan and Dan Muser. each of whom represents substantial parts of Berks County in the United States Congress, and both of whom sit on the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs panel. We think it's a very interesting presentation, a good exercise in civility and the way democracy really works in a good civil society. I'm convinced of that. We have a large student presence in our audience, but we have room for some more people to register for this, and we hope you will. Go to our website, very, very simple. We really need everyone to join together, and if you're interested in a live presentation with good food, a nice gathering at the Doubletree May 5, please come and register. May 11, a young man, James Garrett, about to graduate from Penn State University, who spent 2 weeks in Qatar this past November, and will be presenting to us on his experience there and his perspective. He's graduating with a degree in political science and a minor in history. And I think I've had several strong conversations with him. A very interesting presentation that he is preparing. Continuing with all that we are bringing to you folks, June 1, Diversity in Israel with Gadir Kamel Mari. Gadir is the Jewish Agency's first Druid emissary to the United States, based in Washington, D.C. Presently, she was elected to the Knesset as a member of the Blue and White Party, making history as the first Druze woman to become a member of the Israeli Knesset. We all are aware that the new arm of our national security, our military, is the Space Force, in parallel with our Navy and Army and the Marines, the Air Force. We have a presentation on that very interesting topic, new topic for most of us, with Colonel Benjamin R. Ogden of the United States Army. He is the operations and education officer. He's the education officer at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. Then finally, June 22, not yet posted, Dr. Sigrid Postanzi will be speaking to us on the inclusion of refugees, returning to this topic perhaps today, into the German education system, lessons learned from 2015. She is the research assistant on democracy, transfer, and policy advice with the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, and her presentation is being underwritten by the German American Institute in Tübingen. So that will conclude our program year through June, folks. Lots coming. We hope you're interested and can participate. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, all. And thank you to Laura, as Saul said, for an excellent presentation today. I do have some questions coming in. Before we get to that, I just want to double down on Saul's announcement about our May 5th presentation at the Doubletree downtown. This is our first return to in-person programming. It should be a great panel discussion with 2 of our local congressional representatives. Major gauge of interest in returning to in-person programming. So if you want to attend that, the easiest way to get tickets, which you do have to buy tickets in advance by the 24th, is just go to the WAC website, wacwriting.org, and right across the top, big banner with a button that'll take you to Eventbrite to purchase your ticket. So please, please, please do that early. All right, and then one comment to you, Saul. It looks like only about half of your question got into the chat. So if you want to enter the rest of that question, I will ask it very shortly. I'll make a comment to Adrian Grieve, who asked about if you would be willing to share the presentation. And instead of putting you on the spot, I'll say we've had trouble in the past coordinating and distributing the presentations like this. So my suggestion would be check out the YouTube channel, check out the recording on Facebook. You can see the entire presentation there. Cool. All right. So, Laura. Excellent presentation, very informative. There some questions I have my own questions. I know you are a language specialist, more maybe than an immigration specialist, and we appreciate you sharing the research today. I'm very interested in how we talk about immigration, so I think that'll be a good setup. A little bit of a technical question from Paul Escueda in the chat. Do you know if Spain has a visa program like the US for citizens of extraordinary abilities, Visa O or Process EB1?
Yeah, I think this is what I mentioned about the blue card. I think the blue card will be this can be or was designed to promote legal migration in the European Union. and to promote work and residence. It's like a work and residence permit for non-European nationals, and it provides kind of the socio-economic rights and a path towards permanent residency at some point. And it's basically to attract like higher skilled workers to work in kind of specialized jobs. And yeah, but again, like I was talking all the time about cooperation amongst countries, cooperation, because there are some countries still which are not part of this program, the blue card. For example, Denmark is not part of it. Ireland is not part of it. Of course, the UK now is not part of it. So there's still, you know, some gaps there. But I think that would be the similar thing that we have in Europe.
For that category of immigrants.
Yeah.
Gerald Sieber had asked about a citation for the slide that you showed about actual immigration numbers versus perceived immigration numbers. I think I saw in your citations slide the correct information, but I had looked that up and put it into the chat also, where that slide came from. It was the Alesina, Miano, and Stancheva paper, Immigration and Redistribution.
Yes,
so
yes.
Just to make that comment. I thought what stood out to me on that slide was the comment at the bottom that said, it was a special note about the US specifically, that it does include illegal immigration in the actual number. I thought it was interesting that they had to make that clarification. I could hear that rebuttal coming already.
Yeah.
So I guess from my perspective, American citizen, don't travel a whole lot. You mentioned about like the increase rise of xenophobic movements. I think we've probably seen that here in the US over the past 2 decades at least or so. How is that kind of a common trend around the world? Do other countries, Spain in particular, look at immigration this way? It seems like we kind of conflate immigration and refugees. We think of it as a problem for poor people. We think of as a problem with people of color. But you talked about several cases where it's a much bigger issue than that, promotes economic health. Like how much do we share in our perception of, or how much is Spain different in how they think about immigration?
Well, as I said, somehow people are not getting the real data. First of all, they are not getting the real numbers of the reality of what's going on. I think that maybe one factor, because what that is happening is fake news, social media, how people share things on. So people are not getting the news from the press directly anymore. So they just go on Facebook, Instagram, and see what it's there for them to see. But the reality is that if you look at Spain, if you look at France, if you look at the elections that happened just last weekend, you see the far right parties are the ones that are getting more support from voters. And what happened in France, it can be very, very important, because if France is in a position where the European sense of unity and all of that is in danger, France is one of those countries which is right now the main supporter for that. That could be something dangerous for the European Union as to be kept as a union still. So that could be something very, very transcendental. I don't know if that answers your question, because I don't know. It's something that we see. I mean, we see in Europe. We have seen it in Italy. We have seen it with the Brexit in the UK, and I think it's something that is happening all over the world. And I don't know, I think it's also lack of communication when you don't know the other person, when you don't know the other people that are coming to your country. You tend to think that, you know, they are different. They're supposed to be a threat for you. They are going to, you know.
I guess part of the reason I maybe was hopeful that it was a little more different was the headline that you shared about Spain requiring 3.5 million immigrants over the next couple of years for economic health. The article about reliance on the immigration for the economic engine. It seemed from that maybe there was a little bit more open acknowledgement that this is not all just downside, that there is a benefit to this, that we have to keep this going.
Yeah, and this is something that people have to know, because it's not, immigration is you know, always brings bad and conflicts, and you know, people are coming from poor countries, they are bringing their bad habits into our countries. It's not like that, but people have to know.
Do you have any maybe tips for us about the language we use around immigration that would help to facilitate the education and common understanding?
I think we have just to naturalize the way we talk about people who are coming. And as I said, like I started my presentation saying that immigration is nothing new. Immigration is nothing new. Societies has been developing and they have been settled because of people going and coming since the origin of humankind. So we need to explain that to people, that this is not any trend, that this is how society is conformed. This is how we can get a lot from it, from exchanges, from talking to people who think differently from you. And I mean, I don't know, I see a lot of advantages.
It seems obvious, but apparently we're still struggling with it.
Yeah.
Jeanette Winkler asks, should the United Nations play a role with environmental refugees? An opinion on that?
They should play a role. Yes, I think they already play a role. There's a lot on the plate, I think. But what is coming in the near future is again is going to need the cooperation of all countries, and especially rich countries. They have a lot of responsibility, because what's the point of, you know, cutting the emissions of gas in the European zone, but then the European companies are outsourcing, or like dislocating the factories to Eastern Asian, to East Asian countries. So I mean, and then we say, okay, so it's them who are polluting the environment. No, it's not them, it's companies, are European companies. But yeah, of course, the UN has to play a big role on that, and also the United States, and also the more developed economies.
Sure, big effort. Everybody needs to get involved. Rita Belidi asks, when accepting immigrants, has Spain set quotas for certain countries? Is there a sense that immigrants from some countries are more desirable?
That's a good question. And that's something that could make think us about what is happening in Ukraine, for example. Why this wave of refugees has been accepted so well at this moment, and that's something that has not happened, for example, in Spain, specifically in Spain, in so many other situations in the past, where, you know, immigrants have to go through a lot of very long processes to get, like years to wait for permits, for visas, for, you know, some stability. And now people coming from Ukraine are, getting express visas, the paperwork is much easier. So that shows that when you want really do want to do really do something, or when you want to do something really, and you are willing to do it, and you have intention, things can work out,
Just a matter of your priorities.
So it's a matter of priorities. But what is prioritized in this case? I don't know.
And maybe we'll wrap up with this question from Paul Escueda again. Can you comment on the level of assimilation of non-Hispanic immigrants in Spain, language and cultural assimilation?
Bueno, there are programs, associations that try to get them involved, to get them in terms of language learning and cultural learning involved in the society. And I think it depends on the place where they go also, because if they arrive like in a big city like Madrid or Barcelona, they are going to be, of course, in contact with immigrants from the same nationality as them. So that could be like a way of creating, segregated areas and ghettos and people just from that nationality. But if they arrive to places where, people are maybe more, you have to mingle with locals and the place is maybe smaller, I think the adaptation can be easier.
And I think actually, I have one more question I'm going to ask. It'll be a fun one. Super appreciate you coming to speak to us today. And then just ask one more question, have Saul come on with some if he has any closing comments. When you were doing your research for this presentation, what do you think was the most interesting fact or thing that you came across in doing the research for the presentation personally?
I think, and maybe because this is what I've seen in the newspapers recently, is like some people or press or news are really trying to wake up people by saying that, hey, immigration is really something that we need, something that is important. If you want to think only in economic terms, this is something that we need even more. If you don't want to talk about, intercultural, mix or exchange, cultural exchange. If you don't want to talk about that, that's fine. But even if you only want to talk about economics, immigration is something that we need. And we need to start to have a plan now. And this is something that, I don't know, I think it's coming up, and I am glad that, that I see these kind of ideas and articles that are coming in the press very often, lately, very often. So that was something, I don't know, that was interesting.
Good, excellent. Again, great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Most of our members hung on until the very end, which is always a good sign. A lot of interest in the topic. Thanks again for joining today. And Saul, do you have any closing comments?
Well, just to say thank you to you, Michael, for hosting today. Very well done. And Laura, again, the data that you shared with us gives us a lot to think about. I think we all know that across the world, society is aging. And that's to your point then, when immigration can help with that aging population to stem, as you were saying in some of your later presentation, the needs for workers in various categories. So very well done, young lady, if I may say it that way. And good speed to you as you finish your doctorate. And thank you, Madam John, for bringing Laura to us.
You are very welcome.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.